Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Today's tutorial is showing you how I created this Gatsby inspired 60th cake. To begin with, I wanted to say that this cake took me over 8 hours to decorate it and it caused me so much anxiety at the time. You heard that right, even as a professional you don't always get things right, and I certainly stress over cakes that I make for my friends and family. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, today we are starting off by sandwiching 6 layers of mud cake with vanilla bean buttercream and lemon curd filling. For this cake, I piped a white chocolate ganache dam on the outer edge of each layer so that the filling wouldn't come out the sides and that it held the cake firmly in its place, as this was going to be a 2-tier cake. Once I sandwiched and filled the entire cake, I then crumb coated the whole cake in white chocolate ganache. As always, I like to smooth out the top first on the cake and then use the excess ganache to apply to the sides of the cake. Once I was happy with the application, I used a cake scraper to smooth out the sides and remove the excess. I would normally pop this into the fridge for about 30 minutes to set up after I'd finished crumb coating it. However, it was in the middle of winter that I made this cake and the ganache pretty much set up immediately after applying it. So now that the crumb coat was set, I went in with my final coat of ganache for the outside. I added more white chocolate ganache on the top of the cake and then smoothed it out before using the lid method to mask the rest of the cake with the ganache. As you can see, I placed a cardboard cake board on top of the cake and then used the cake scraper to ensure it had the correct placement, same as the bottom cake board. I then started filling in the sides of the cake with the white chocolate ganache. I'm using this method to try and make sure that the square shape is as crisp as possible, as the finished icing today will be in black ganache, not fondant. Once I was happy with the general shape, I cleaned up the sides of my cake with the scraper, often heating it up in hot water to make it easier to work with and smooth the ganache. Just a quick side note, it was exceptionally difficult working with the ganache this day as it was setting so quickly due to it being so cold in my kitchen. This is where my anxiety over this cake started to kick in. Once I smoothed it to a place where I was happy with it, I popped it to the side to let it settle while I was filling and sandwiching the top tier. The second tier was a 6-inch chocolate sponge cake filled with dark chocolate buttercream, and the crumb coat was done in dark chocolate ganache. And piping a dam of ganache to hold in the filling, as I wanted this cake to be super stable. This tier ended up having 5 layers of cake, as I wanted it to be slightly taller than my normal sized cakes. Once I was happy with how the cake was filled, I actually just did the final coat on this cake. I didn't do a crumb coat beforehand when I applied the dark chocolate ganache. I applied the ganache on the top, smoothing that out, and then applying it on the sides and then smoothing that out with the cake scraper. I then popped this to the side so it could firm up. As you can see, the ganache is a really nice soft consistency to apply to the cake. I first applied to the top and then the sides. Once applied, I used my tool cake scraper to smooth out the sides by dragging the scraper from back to front and then bottom to top to ensure it keeps a really crisp square shape. Because it was such a cold day, the ganache was almost setting immediately and I was getting increasingly stressed over this bottom tier. Anyways, after I was semi-happy with how it was looking, I popped that into the fridge to firm up completely and did the final coat on the second tier. This top tier was getting covered in white chocolate ganache. I just cut off the rough edge to make it smooth and then applied white chocolate ganache to the top of the cake and smoothed it using the cake scraper. Again, not having the best time applying this due to the kitchen being so cold. Anyways, I removed the top edge of the white ganache with a knife and then popped that over to the side to set up. Now comes the stenciling on the tall square cake, and this pretty much is what sent me over the edge. So for this stencil, I didn't have any appropriate stencils for the Gatsby design, so I made one. I found a design that I liked from Google Images and printed that out on an A4 piece of paper. Instead of covering it in tape like I normally do for my stencils, I laminated this stencil and then cut out the design that I wanted it to stencil on the cake. In hindsight, I would definitely suggest investing in a stencil, but I didn't have time to order one and I don't really see myself doing another Gatsby inspired cake anytime soon. So this served its purpose for me. Right, so I grabbed the cake out of the fridge and I started layering the stencil onto the front of the cake. I pressed the stencil lightly onto the front of the cake. Once the stencil was placed on, I then used some black ganache I covered the cake in to fill in the stencil using an offset spatula. Once covered, I used the cake scraper to remove the excess ganache. I then went in with edible gold paint and painted the black ganache, still leaving the stencil on there. Once covered in the edible gold paint, I let that dry and then peeled off the stencil. Once the stencil was removed, and at this point I was definitely having a meltdown over this cake, I then started preparing the supports for the bottom tier. Using wooden dowels, I marked using a pencil where I needed to cut the dowels. I used 5 for this cake. Once they were cut, I grabbed a 6-inch cake card and placed that in the centre of the bottom tier and gently scored it with a knife so that I knew where to place the dowels. I did 2 at the top and 2 at the bottom and then 1 in the centre. I then filled this in with black ganache to stick the top and bottom tiers together. I then placed the top tier of the cake and pressed down to ensure that it adhered to the bottom. I then melted some white chocolate ganache to pipe between the top and bottom tier to make it look seamless. I melted the ganache too much and it was a runny mess, so don't do that. I want the ganache to be pliable, not runny, to fill in that gap. Then I used my fingers to smooth out the ganache. I used another smoother to really smooth it out. Once the ganache was cleaned up, I then applied some edible glue to the bottom of the tier so that I could add some edible gold lace. I then added the gold lace about 1/2 centimeter from the bottom of the top tier, then going in with a small open star piping tip, I piped a border to cover up the bottom space. After this, I repeated what I did with the stencil on the other 2 sides of the cake, so all 3 front-facing sides had the same gold stencil. To finish the cake, I added a gold topper that said Happy 60th, and behind that I pressed a bubble tea straw into the top tier. This is so that I could add the feather-like decorations into the top of the cake. I just moved them around until I was happy with the placement. Then using floral tape, I wrapped together 2 feathers and some fake gold plant, and then added that to the top of the bottom tier on the left hand side and the bottom of the second tier on the right hand side. Once wrapped, I pressed them directly into the cake. That was it for this cake. I was happy with the end result, but at the time of making it, I was so stressed and anxious I made myself feel sick. Professionals make mistakes all the time and have bad caking days too. One motto I have lived by since starting out in the cake world is that it's not how well you can decorate the cake, but how well you can hide your mistakes, and it was definitely something that rang true to me when making this cake. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video and more of a personal insight into how I was feeling during the process of making this cake.